Hello again. In today's video, I would like to talk to you about reading as a skill in the context of foreign language learning. Yes, reading as a skill. When we talk about foreign language learning and teaching, we typically conceive of it in four basic skills: reading, writing, speaking, and listening, right? Reading, writing, speaking, listening. But I would like to tell you that it doesn't really make sense to think about reading as one skill. And if you do think about reading as one skill, it can negatively affect the trajectory of your foreign language learning journey. In other words, it can have a negative influence on how you study a language, what you study in the language, how you feel about yourself when you study the language, and so on and so forth. So, if you are new to this channel, here I talk about foreign languages, linguistics, and how you can learn languages more quickly and effectively. So if that sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and subscribe. Alright, but let's get into today's topic, reading as a subject. Reading as a skill, rather I should say. Reading as a skill, and why you shouldn't think of it as one skill. Now before I get started, I know some people are going to think, oh, I know what you mean. You mean like the difference between skinning and skimming and scanning and sight reading and that, right? No, that's not what I mean. That might be part of the discussion somewhere, but it's not what I mean. So let me just go ahead and tell you what I mean. Well, first of all, when we go to learn a foreign language, there's many different stages we go through with reading, and basically our reading strategies, we might not realize, are often very focused on a certain aspect of reading. Now, the first aspect of reading, of course, is being able to recognize how the language is pronounced, like looking at the symbols or the characters that the language is written with and knowing how to pronounce them. Now, of course, this difference is much greater if you learn a language like Japanese or Chinese or Korean or Hindi or Urdu, where they use a completely different script from what you might be used to, right? But of course, it holds true for if your native language is English and you go to study German or French or Polish, it's also true, right? Even though they use the same writing system, basically the same, there might be a few accent marks and stuff you have to get used to, but you have to be able to recognize the symbols and be able to pronounce them. But that is, of course, not the whole story, right? Because even if you can read it in the sense that you know how to pronounce it when you see a word, that doesn't necessarily mean you understand it, right? So first of all, we have to get straight the idea of being able to read something and be able to pronounce it, and read something and being able to understand it. Okay? So that's the first big distinction that we need to make. Secondly, we need to recognize that what we are reading has a huge effect on our ability to actually engage with it and understand it, that is. Now, that is to say, there's a huge difference from reading, let's say, a newspaper and understanding it, and the skills that are required to do so, and reading a text message and being able to understand it. And we could say the same thing for a blog post, a screenplay, a novel, a poem, whatever the information is on the back of the box for the nutrition facts of the food that you bought, or whatever website you're looking at, the official information if you're going to a country and you have to fill out migration papers and stuff. All of these different contexts engage different sets of vocabulary in different conventions. And this means that it's very possible for you to be able to read and understand one of these super well to the level of proficiency which is not so different from a native speaker, and yet not be able to understand another one at all. Okay? Let me reiterate that using a little bit more concrete terms. What I mean is, it can be very normal for you to be able to read and understand text messages just fine, but then when you go to read a newspaper, not be able to understand anything. And furthermore, it can be very normal to be able to read a newspaper and understand everything, but then when you go to open a book like a novel, then not understand anything. Okay? And this is important to understand for a few different reasons. It's because, well, first of all, it's important because we might feel like we are bad at reading because the material we're typically engaging with or trying to read or maybe we're going to a class and they're giving us this reading material and we're like, oh, this is so difficult. We might think we're bad at reading when maybe we're only actually bad at reading in this context. Or maybe it's not good to say bad, because you can always practice and get better, of course, but maybe it's because you're testing yourself in a context which is not actually the one which is interesting to you or relevant to you. If you are studying a foreign language because you want to be able to make friends and contacts and just have fun and talk with people and meet people, then it doesn't really make sense to study language by reading newspapers, because you can get really good at reading news and then still have trouble with exchanging text messages. Now, the converse is true. You can actually, like I said, be super good at reading and writing text messages, but not be able to read newspapers at all. And that's okay. It's okay. You don't have to be able to read everything. I know some people will try to tell you, oh, you need to be good at reading. You should read the news every day. You should read 100 articles. And it's very important that you know all this vocabulary. Not necessarily. It's not necessarily important. Well, if it's relevant to you, if it's what you like, if it's what you care about, if your career or your personal interests depend on it, then yeah, you need to practice it. And depending on your language, it may be easier or harder. Another thing which kind of complicates the matter is that, well, for some language pairs, like if your native language is English, it might be relatively easy to read the news in French. But if your native language is English, it would be really, really hard to read the news in Japanese. But maybe it's pretty easy to get to the level of Japanese where you understand text messages and you can text back and forth in Japanese, but maybe it's harder to do this in French. What I'm saying is that all of this about reading levels and what you should read and what is good to read and so on and so forth is really highly context dependent. It depends on you and your goals. It also depends on what language you're studying and what your native language is. But it's very important to know that there's not one such thing as being good at reading. You can be super good at understanding the news, read the news every day, 100 articles, and never run into a word you don't know. But then open up a novel and not know most of the words on the page. How is that possible? You might think because we don't realize when we learn our native languages that we tend to learn all of these things at the same time. We're learning how to write letters. At the same time, they make us in school read novels, and then at the same time, they make us in school write essays and read newspapers, and this is all going on at once. So we just think of it as one thing, reading as the one skill. We don't think about reading as reading factual things versus reading literature versus reading casual communication. It's very different to be able to understand and read a blog post, than it is to read a news article. And it can be very different to read a blog than it is to read a novel. And each one of these things is very distinct. And so I think that sometimes I found a lot of foreign language learners who are kind of running their heads into a brick wall, so to speak, because they're trying to develop reading proficiency in an area which is actually not relevant to them. Like maybe they're reading the news every day because someone told them it was a good idea, but actually that content doesn't interest them and it's not important to them. They actually need to read blog posts. That's what's interesting to them. And that's maybe way easier. Maybe they can already even do this. And it's totally okay. You're not less of a language learning, it's not like you're less of a person because you only like blog posts and so you can only understand blog posts and you can't understand the news. Don't believe the haters, so to speak. Don't believe your foreign language teachers or whoever is trying to influence you. If you're just interested in the language just to talk with people and just to chat, it's totally cool if you just only have the ability to read text messages, which typically would be much easier than reading any form of print. And if you're only interested in reading the news, then don't listen to people who are like, oh, but if you really want to be good at reading, then you should read literature. Well, that's fine, but reading literature and reading the news are two completely different skills. think you can understand this, especially if you get to higher levels in a foreign language. When you compare these, you can often, whichever one you used to study, if you studied a lot using a lot of literature and then go read a lot of the news, you're like, oh, there's so much vocabulary that I didn't know, and vice versa. People that tend to read a lot of the news go and read literature and feel completely lost. So basically what I want to say is the take-home messages for today's video is basically you should think about reading specifically in the context of what your goals are. And you shouldn't listen to people who tell you how you should study to increase your reading skills, because often this is a reflection of their personal background, which depends on their personal goals, their native language or languages they know, and the target language. And none of that might be relevant for you in your situation with your native language and your target languages. So you should remember that, stay focused on what it is that you are interested in this language, because you might spend a lot of time and effort in areas which aren't necessarily relevant to you. Of course, it's possible that you want this holistic ability to read anything. And if that's your goal, then you will have to study each one of these things separately. But also remember, it's totally okay. Like I said, don't listen to people who guilt you or try to influence how you study. Think about what it is that you want to do in the language and focus on that. This will really help you if you remember that reading these different kinds of materials in these different kinds of contexts is a completely different skill. Reading is not just one skill, it is a set of many different skills, and they all kind of have to be trained differently. So that's the main point of today's video. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon in another video.